This is the world's thinnest curved screen smartphone in the Tecno Slim. It measures in at just 5.95 millimeters thick, which puts it in the same category as the Galaxy S25 Edge. Except while Samsung was only able to squeeze in a 3900 mAh battery, Tecno somehow equipped the Slim with a massive 5160 mAh unit. Now, we've got a number of tests lined up for this phone, putting it head-to-head against the S25 Edge, but first, let's take a look at what's inside the box, where in addition to sending us the phone, Tecno is also sponsoring this video, where right on top, you get a case for the phone. It's nothing fancy, but hey, it's included. Obviously, you get the phone itself, and unlike most phones nowadays, Tecno actually includes a power brick that's capable of charging the phone at up to 45 watts, along with the included USB-C cable. But here is the Slim itself, and man, this thing just lives up to its name. I mean, it is incredibly thin, where, I know on paper it's not technically any thinner than the S25 Edge, but because of the curved edges and the curved screen, it just feels that way. I mean, like the phone can literally hide behind a pencil, and when you have it in your pocket, it's almost like it isn't there. And a big part of that isn't just because of how thin it is, but also how light it is, with it weighing in at just 158 grams, which combined with the 6.78-inch screen makes this arguably one of the most comfortable big screen smartphones out there, with it having the highest screen size to weight ratio that I've ever seen. Speaking of the screen, the bezels on here are pretty slim. Like, they're not the thinnest in the world, but they're right in line with what you'd expect with this price point. And the panel itself, though, is solid. It's an AMOLED display with a 1.5K resolution, and Tecno says it's capable of reaching up to 4500 nits of peak brightness. Of course, I think global brightness is arguably the more important spec when it comes to brightness, where the entire screen is lit up instead of like a small little window. And in this category, the Slim actually did better than I was expecting. In our sustained brightness test, it was actually brighter than the Edge for the first 3 minutes at around 1460 nits versus 1320, but by minutes 4 and 5, it did dim down to 622, which brought its average to 1184 compared to the Edge's 1320, which isn't bad at all, especially considering that this thing has a 144 Hz refresh rate instead of the typical 120 Hz that you see. Like, I don't know if that's something that most people can see. I certainly can't see the difference between 120 and 144, but some people swear that they can. And at the very least, it does give this phone some bragging rights. Which, on a similar note, let's talk about these lights on the back of the camera system, or what Tecno is calling mood lighting. Now, I'll be honest, this is probably not going to be the most practical thing that you use on a day-to-day basis, but it does give the phone a little bit of personality. And to be fair, Tecno did try to bake in some actual functionality. For example, it'll light up when you get calls and notifications. You get different animations when the phone is charging. There's a low battery reminder, a startup sequence, and there's even this flip to flash gesture. But for me, the main draw of this is just the way it looks, especially with this white and like the clean bar that goes across the top. It just makes this phone feel futuristic. It's kind of like a phone that you'd expect to see in a sci-fi movie. But here in reality, I think the big story with the Tecno Slim is actually its battery, because usually when you get a phone that's this thin, you expect to give up some capacity. We certainly see that with the S25 Edge only having 3900 mAh. So at least on paper, this phone having 5160 mAh is impressive. Of course, capacity alone doesn't tell you the whole story. Battery life also depends on other factors like the display, the efficiency of the chip, and a bunch of other software optimizations, where the S25 Edge does have the advantage of that 3nm Snapdragon 8 Elite versus the 6nm Dimensity 6400 on the Slim. So to see how things actually play out in the real world, we put both phones through our signature 2-day battery test. Starting off with a 1-hour phone call, where the Slim only dropped by 1 point compared to the S25 Edge's 4-point drop. Now, we have seen plenty of phones overrepresent on their battery early on, so I wouldn't read too much into this result, but it does give the Slim an early lead. Here in messaging, we have our automated chatbot texting back and forth with each phone, where this time the S25 Edge does better, cutting the gap down to just 2 percentage points. Here in email, it's worth noting that we've calibrated the displays on both phones to 200 nits, so everything's going to be as fair as possible, where after an hour of scrolling through the same set of emails, the Galaxy's comeback continues, with it now pulling just 1 point behind the Slim. But it's this browser test that will be telling, because we're actually taxing the chipsets more than in the previous tests by randomly cycling through the same set of websites, where this time the Tecno does better, increasing its lead back up to 3 points, which is kind of surprising. I was expecting the opposite to happen there during the more CPU intensive task, but it looks like that Dimensity 6400 was pretty efficient there. Here in Instagram, we're just scrolling through the home feed like you would in real life, where I'm not sure how that 144Hz panel on the Slim is going to be able to ramp itself down between the scrolls compared to the Galaxy's LTPO display, where 1 hour later, the Galaxy did have the advantage, pulling back within 1 point of the Slim as we move on to the 16-hour standby. Now, everything else being equal, usually it's the phone with the bigger battery that outperforms here in standby, and that is exactly what we see, with the Slim doing 1 point better, meaning heading into YouTube, the Slim has a 2-point advantage. One thing worth noting here in YouTube is we calibrate the speakers on each phone to the nearest decibel count. It's measured from 2 feet out from the center of the phone's screens, where because we got the Slim with early pre-release software, there was a bug causing that top earpiece speaker to not work properly, meaning we had to crank the volume up from the bottom firing speaker louder than usual in order to be able to match the Galaxy's decibel count. But 1 hour later, it didn't really seem to hurt it, with the Slim doing 3 points better this time. Although I expect the Galaxy to have the advantage here in Alto's adventure, since while Alto's isn't the most intensive game out there, it is taxing the GPUs on each phone, where that 3nm Snapdragon 8 Elite might have the advantage. But 1 hour later, no, it's the Slim that does better, pulling another 2 points ahead. Honestly, I don't know if that was due to efficiency or if the Galaxy's battery indicator is just being more realistic now, but either way, we are starting to see some real separation, with the Slim adding yet another point to its lead after an hour of simulated navigation. In Spotify, we have our robots listening to music, where again, it's worth noting that the speaker outputs were calibrated to the nearest decibel count, where 60 minutes later, the S25 Edge's fall continues, with it falling another 4 points behind, meaning 26 hours into testing, the Slim now has a 12-point lead. Of course, things might change here in Snapchat, where this task is just super intensive, with the screens, the cameras, the microphone and the speakers, and even the Wi-Fi on each phone all being used in a loop, where 59 minutes into the test, the S25 Edge's 22% that it started with fully depletes, at which point the Slim still has 21% left to go. So there you have it, a 21-point advantage for the Slim, which not only allows it to finish with Snapchat, but it also went on to App Cycle, where we open and close apps in a loop, with it being able to go for a full 1 hour and 47 minutes, actually tying the result that we got from the iPhone 15 Pro Max. So really impressive results there. Now, when it comes to charging the phones back up, the Slim comes with that 45-watt fast charger in the box, while the S25 Edge supports up to 25 watts, where because the Edge has that smaller battery, it actually makes the two phones look like they're charging at the same rate, with each phone hitting 52% after 30 minutes. But in reality, of course, the Slim has a much bigger battery to charge, and as we saw in the battery test, that same 52% will obviously last you a lot longer. But battery life is only part of a phone, right? Like, performance is arguably just as important, and this is where the Slim takes a slightly different approach to what Samsung is doing with the S25 Edge, where while the Edge is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Elite, the 5G version of the Slim here is powered by MediaTek's mid-range Dimensity 6400. It also comes with just 8GB RAM instead of 12GB like on the Galaxy, although they do include an option to expand that RAM virtually if you want by another 8GB if you want. But I'd say the biggest critique I have here isn't the RAM or even the chip, but the storage speed, with Tecno going with UFS 2.2 instead of the faster UFS 4.0 that you'll find on the Galaxy, which means you're not going to see those blazing fast app launches or file transfers. But for everyday stuff like messaging, social media, and browsing, it still is able to get the job done. I mean, I even tried out playing some games like Subway Surfers and Call of Duty, and while you won't get maxed out settings, the experience on here is still totally playable. And that philosophy kind of carries over to the back, where you get a 50 megapixel main camera, and in good lighting, the main camera can deliver some pretty solid results. I got a number of good looking shots in a short little photo session, but in low light, you do start to see some of the limitations of the sensor. But the good news is Tecno added a bunch of AI photo editing tools on here, where you have stuff like AI eraser to remove unwanted objects, there's image extender that can add to your background, and there's even a sharpness tool to clean up your shots if you need it, which, considering that the camera isn't the main focus on here, is nice to have. Alright, so last couple of things I wanted to talk about in terms of hardware is up front, the Slim's display is protected by Corning's Gorilla Glass, with Tecno saying that the phone also meets military-grade shock resistance standards, so it should be fairly durable, especially considering how light it is. On the back, inside of the camera housing, you also get an IR blaster, meaning you'll be able to control your TV or other devices, which is always a nice bonus. And then in terms of software, the Slim is running on Android 15 with Tecno's HiOS over top. So as you'd expect from a phone in 2025, it comes with a bunch of AI features. For example, there's an AI call assistant that can answer your calls for you and help filter out spammers. You also get AI writing tools pretty much anywhere that you can type, and Tecno even has their own AI assistant on here called Ella, which is powered by DeepSeek, meaning you actually get two LLMs on here, considering that Google's Gemini obviously is deeply integrated. As far as software updates go, Tecno is only promising 1 year of OS updates and 2 years of security patches, so definitely on the low end of the update spectrum. So I think it's really going to come down to how Tecno will ultimately price this thing and how much you care about software updates. But once I have pricing details, I'll update the description down below. But yeah, that is the Tecno Slim. I think this is an interesting option for anybody who just wants a big screen experience in a device that's light and comfortable to hold, while also having some personality to it. And with its stellar battery life, I think it sets the bar on that front for Samsung and the upcoming iPhone 17 Air, at least in terms of what's possible in this crazy thin and light form factor. But anyways, that is it for me in this video. Big thanks to Tecno for sponsoring the showcase. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the very next episode.